Hey, welcome back everybody. This is Ian, and in this video I'm going to show you a little project that I've been working on where I'm utilizing PocketBase for a backend as a service, plugging that into ExpressJS so that I can use EJS templates and we can server-side render our templates, and then on the front end we can use HTMX for all of our interactivity. So let's go ahead and dive into it. So far the application doesn't have a whole lot, just basic user authentication. And actually, PocketBase is designed to authenticate using JSON Web Tokens or JWTs or JOTs. And the way that we're doing it is we're just plugging it into Passport or Passport Local Strategy, which uses either a username and an email, username or email, and a password to authenticate a user. And what we'll do is we'll register a user with their email and password through PocketBase, and we'll pass it from the front end to Express, and then we'll pass that to PocketBase. Create that user, and then we'll authenticate them for login using those credentials. And then so we get back this object with the JSON Web Token, which we're not using because we don't have a client-side library like React or anything like that. And what we'll end up doing is just taking that user ID from that authenticated user and using it to create a session for the logged in user until they log out, at which point we'll just remove the session. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. So I have a terminal open here, and you can see it has 2 or 3 different things inside of it. It has a PocketBase file, which is all of PocketBase. It has two different folders here, data and migrations, but the actual application is inside this single PocketBase file. And if you don't know, PocketBase is like a backend as a service in a single file, uses SQLite, is super portable, really small, and it gives you a fully functional backend right away. You can tap into it with their API. You can do user authentication. You can create your schema very quickly. It has a lot of stuff built in. We'll show you that in a second. And then over here in this other one, we've got the actual Express application. So if we list everything inside here, just your typical views directory, we've got our node modules for all of our packages, the dependencies, then our package.json, package.json, and app.js. The meat and potatoes is inside app.js. I haven't moved it out into MVC structure just yet because the app is so small. So we'll go ahead and get this running with no daemon. And in the event that we need to debug, we would actually not use no daemon. We would just use the debug console and VS Code. But right now we're not debugging anything. So we'll just go ahead and spin it up with nodemon, no daemon, whatever you want to say, however you want to pronounce it. Okay, so then PocketBase fun over here is our PocketBase backend. This is really simple. You just ./PocketBase and then use the serve command from the CLI. And so right away you can see that it's running on localhost 8090, and then it has a API endpoint and it has an admin user interface endpoint. So we'll go take a look at that real quick because it's pretty cool. Okay, so here it is. You can see all my users. So I'm logged in to PocketBase. I have 2 collections, and so because it's SQLite, we're gonna, even though technically these are tables, I think they call them collections. Yeah, you can even see up here it says search collections. Anyway, the syntax is relational in nature because it is a SQL database, but the naming of the various things is specific to PocketBase and maybe SQLite. I don't know. I'm not super familiar with the syntax for SQLite. So we have a collection for users, and it has all the auth stuff built in. So if you go over to editing of the collection, you can see that they've got things like API rules. They've got various options. You can use OAuth too, so you can connect a lot of different services like Google, Facebook, GitHub, etc. You can add custom fields that give you some default system fields: ID, created, updated, username, email visibility, which is a Boolean, whether or not you can actually see the email, and then verified, another Boolean, whether or not the user has been verified. So if you want to send like a verification email to that user when they register to make sure that they actually own that email and cut down on any like bot signups, you can do that. So then you can add additional things like avatar, and they actually have file upload integrated into PocketBase by default. So you see all the different options here for different fields. We've got bool for Boolean, select, date, time, number, JSON, relation, URL, rich editor, which is nice, then regular plain text, email, and then lastly file. So we're not going to mess with any of these right now. Just want to show you what that looks like. So you have your API preview over here, and you can see all these different operations for CRUD, and then the corresponding code for the JavaScript SDK, and then they've got one for Dart. and so you can see how you can interact with it that way. But again, they have endpoints for all this stuff, so if you just want to interact with PocketBase from whatever backend or even front end that you're using, you can do that. So they have a bunch of stuff for auth with password. That's what we're going to end up using, and all we have to do is pass a valid email or username and password to this endpoint, and then it'll give us back a 200 with that user object and some other stuff if that user is actually authenticated, exists in the database, and all the credentials are correct, or it'll give us back some type of error if they don't exist. Cool. So there's other stuff in here for sending like a verification email request or confirming the verification or request a password reset. There's API endpoints for all this stuff. It's already baked into PocketBase. And then as far as the email is concerned, sending the emails, you can go into settings, I believe, mail settings, and then I don't have it set up yet, but you can go in here and you can turn on like SMTP, or you can connect to whatever API you're using, SendGrid or Mailgun, MailChimp, etc. So there's logs that will give you a nice dashboard overview of all the requests that are made, any errors, anything like that. And then you can actually search through this and see specific things. This all exists inside of a single file, so you can look at it that way too if you wanted to for whatever reason. So back at collections, we do have another collection or another table for posts, and then it's got the ID, the author, the title, the body, and an image, and then they created and updated fields. So you can create as many collections as you want. You can draw relationships between the different collections, one-to-one, one-to-many, and so on. And so that's your backend, one file, literally like 2 commands. Just download it, extract it, and then run it, and then go set up your admin account, which is like the first thing you do when you first visit the backend. All right, cool. So that is how we're going to get like the user authentication and all that stuff out of the way so that we can focus on the meat and potatoes of whatever our application is going to be, maybe a SaaS product or something, or service. All right, so to connect to it, we just use the PocketBase SDK. So over here in our Express application, we can just bring in PocketBase from PocketBase CJS, and then we can create a new PocketBase instance and point it to the active domain with the port for our PocketBase server that's running in the separate tab. So in production, of course, this would just be an environment variable that points to wherever PocketBase is hosted on the web. So then we bring in things like Passport and Express Session for our user authentication, which is going to be using PocketBase, but we still have to have a way to create the session and serialize and deserialize the user and all that stuff. So let's see here. I'm using crypto for something, maybe, not sure if that's just lingering from something else. But then you see EJS-Mate here. That's just for our layout. This is really important for being able to keep not having to recycle a bunch of content and write everything twice. So in your templates, you can just have like one layout or multiple layouts for different areas of the website, and then just a bunch of partials that you plug in. It makes it really easy to go in there and just keep the HTML to a minimum, while also using something like HTMX to get all of your interactivity included. So we'll see more of that here in a minute. All right, so just some more boilerplate code saying we're using EJS for templates, and all the templates are going to live inside the views directory. And then the engine is EJS, and there's 2 different things here. One is App Engine, which is specific to EJS-Mate, if I'm not mistaken. And then the other is setting the view engine, which is EJS for the templates. All right, cool. So some random secret key here that we use with our Express Session configuration. And we're just allowing the user to be logged in for 1 week. You can change that to whatever you want. If you want to mess around with it and just see how it works, you can set it to 1,000 milliseconds and log a user in, or maybe like 10,000 milliseconds or something. And so count to 10, and then you'll see, refresh the page, see that the user has in fact been logged out because the cookie is no longer valid. Okay, so then we create our strategy here. All this stuff needs to be moved into its own config files and everything, but again, there's only like a couple hundred lines of code so far, so everything is in this app.js file for now. But here you can see with the new local strategy, we have the username field set to email. And so we're using the email. Now you can use both email or username with PocketBase. I don't have it configured that way, but if you want to, you could. So I just have it using the email for now. So essentially, that's just a configuration object. And then the next thing that we have here is this callback function, which takes in the email, password, and done. And we take the email and the password and we send them to our PocketBase backend, where it uses the users collection to see if that user exists and whether or not those credentials are valid. So all of the encrypting of the password, or the hashing of the password, and comparing it with the existing hash in the database, all that is abstracted away from us with PocketBase, which is nice. And so then that'll send back either a valid response or an error based on whether or not the user had proper credentials. And then we'll pass, in the case of a valid response, 200, we'll take that auth data object and extract the record from it and then pass it further down the middleware chain, where Passport will continue to use it to serialize the user and so on. So it'll create a session using the user ID, and then it'll send that in the response back to the front end, where the browser will store a cookie with that connect session ID in the browser, at least until it invalidates and then logs the user out. If there's an error, we just pass it down the middleware chain. It can be handled with some other middleware that will catch all of our different errors that might happen. All right, so then we have some code here for serializing and deserializing the user. And so again, that's going to make use of PocketBase. It's going to use the users collection. It's going to take that ID and it's going to pass it to this API call to get that user object, which we then continue to pass further on down the middleware chain. All right, so we have a little bit of middleware here for checking whether or not a user is logged in. And this uses Passport just to see if there's a valid session. If the user is authenticated, then they can go forward to the next function in the middleware chain. In this case, for routing, it might let you into some authorization protected route, maybe your profile or something. So we'll see that here in a minute. If you're not authenticated, then you'll just get redirected back to the home page, which will then use some conditional rendering to show you a login form if you're actually not logged in. More Passport boilerplate stuff for initialization of Passport and the session. And so we're not actually using a session store yet. We will, maybe Redis or something like that. But for now, it's just using in memory. Okay, so we are going to set a local variable for current user. That way in our templates, no matter where we are, we can check and see if a user is logged in just by looking at current user. If it's undefined, they're not logged in. If it's some type of valid object with user information, like their name and their email, or username and email, and then we can utilize that to render information out to the page, but also to conditionally render things, whether or not the user should be able to see them. All right, so then we have some routing happening here. We have our main home root route, which just renders an index template. And because we've already told the application that we're using EJS, we don't actually have to put the .ejs extension at the end. We just say res.render index, and it's actually going to look in the views directory, which we also said this is the default directory for our templates. It's going to look in here for an index.ejs file. There it is. It's going to render that, send that in the response, and then the browser, of course, will output everything to the user. So we have another route for register, which is also just going to retrieve a template and render it. So this one goes into views, but it goes down into a folder called auth and looks for a file called register.ejs. Now we also handle what happens when a form is submitted with a post request to /register, at which point we would expect there to be some information about the newly created user or the newly registered user in the request body. And so we're going to pass that along to our other backend. So it's like a backend communicating with another backend here. And one of them specifically for just kind of like the catching all domain requests and routing them where they need to go. Some of them are going to need to go to our PocketBase backend. Others are not. Some of them are just going to be used for template rendering. And so in this case, it's going to create the new user. Now we don't have to log the user in because we know that the username and password are valid because they were used to create this user. There's no way they couldn't be. So all we have to do is take that newly created user and pass their ID along to rec.login, which is some more middleware that comes with Passport and allows us to, I think it comes with Passport and might just be Express middleware, but one way or another, no, it is from Passport. It's going to create a session for the user. So it's going to serialize using the user object or user ID and create the session, store the cookie in the browser on the front end. So then it redirects to profile, which again is just going to be this guy down here, which renders a profile template. We have other routes here for logging in. It's just gonna render a login template, and then the post request using Passport middleware to authenticate using the local strategy, which is the one we set up with PocketBase, expects an email and a password. If it's successful, it's going to redirect to profile. If it's not successful, it's going to redirect to the home page, which currently has our login on there when you're not logged in, the login form. And lastly, we just have our post request to /logout, which the rec.logout doesn't actually invalidate the token that gets created from authenticating a user in PocketBase when you log a user in, but we're not using that token anyway. We're only creating our own session using this Express backend, and so this rec.logout will invalidate that session, and then it'll redirect you back to the front end. The token we don't care about, it'll expire in due time, but we're not using it anyway. So lastly, we just need to start the server for this Express app and be able to tell the user in the terminal where they can go to preview that. So for development, at least, we can go to localhost with whatever port is being used, in this case 3000, and you can see that over here, localhost 3000. So let's go here and refresh. This is the index page. Okay, we're just using Pico CSS, which is a super lightweight CSS library that makes it to where your website doesn't suck super bad or look really bad when you don't have any styling. And so this is what it looks like. And so we already have a user, but let's just say that we don't. So let's go register and ask for their username. So we'll just make it Ian is cool 100. Sounds like an AIM username from when I was 10 maybe. And then email, we'll just do Ian is cool 100 at AOL.com. How about that? We're going to leave email visibility checked here. So unchecking it would make it to where you can't see the email, and then checking it will make it to where you can. And that'll be in the user profile, but also any request that gets made to find that user information from PocketBase is either going to hide the email based on that Boolean, or it's going to show it. So the user has control over whether or not anyone else can see their email. And then password, just something extremely secure that the CIA would probably be pretty jealous about. All right, let's go ahead and register. Cool. So the first thing that happens when you register, like we mentioned before, is it sends the request with the email and the password in, along with the other information. So the whole rec.body, request body. So the body of the form gets sent to the backend Express, but then that gets passed along to PocketBase. And so PocketBase creates a new user, assuming that those credentials aren't already being used for an existing user, because they have to be unique. Not the password, of course, but the email in this case. And then when it sends a successful response back to our Express backend from PocketBase, then what we do is we take that user ID to create the session. And finally, we redirect to the profile. And so here we are on the profile. And if I take this off full screen, you can actually see it's at /profile, which you're like, of course, that's how it's supposed to be. But we're in our code. If we head over to, let's see here, the index.ejs, for example, and we take a look at, this is the link that would take us to the profile. So we actually didn't have to see this. We missed this because we logged ourselves in and redirected automatically. But if you go to the home page, this is where we previously had the login form. But now that we're actually logged in, we have a session and we have a corresponding cookie. So if you go over to the application and we look in the cookie, you see this connect.sid, session ID. This is the value specific to this user that allows them to go from page to page, maintaining this logged in state. Okay, and it doesn't actually change until you log out. So for example, if I log out, just look at this value here. It ends in RZI. If I log out, you can see immediately it changes. And so now the connect session ID is for a user that is not logged in. And likewise, if we just go log in some other user, this is an existing user, not the one we just created. Here we get redirected to profile, and now the session ID has changed again. I assume it changed, I wasn't paying attention, but it should. So anyway, we log this user out, session ID changes again. We go to Ian, if I can type, ianiscool100@aol.com, extremely secret, super secure password. And again, the session ID changes. So that's the gist of it for basic user authentication with this stack, is that we are sending an email and a password through the login form, and that gets sent to PocketBase from Express. PocketBase authenticates. If the user is valid, they send back this object with the user information. We take the ID of the user from that object and we use it with our Passport middleware and our Express session middleware to create a valid session, and then, which is stored in memory, by the way, for now. And then we send this connect session ID cookie through with a response to the front end, so that, or this value for the cookie, so that the browser knows to store it in a cookie. Okay, so this is allowing us to jump around and maintain this session for each of our logged in users. And now we know with that current user local variable that the username is ianiscool100, and you can see it again here because we're on the profile, and then the email is here. And this /profile, if I refresh, it's the same page. Now if I go back to the home page, you can see this still exists. This is persistent across both pages. And one thing you'll notice is that we're not refreshing here. This is the power of HTMX, is that, well, it refreshes if you physically go to the new page. But if you click on a link or if you submit a form, then you can just see that the UI updated, very smooth, very quick, but no refresh, no full page refresh, nothing like that. And so essentially we're getting the power of JavaScript DOM updating, rendering on the front end via HTMX, while having all of our templates and everything handled for us on the back end. So our API is doing what APIs were intended to do, and it's serving HTML hypertext markup language across the wire, where it's being handled by HTMX on the front end to update the user interface. Okay, so full circle back here to this profile link that we we're just looking at. Here, view profile. That's this one here. It's an anchor tag inside of a div. Content of the text is view profile. The href as a fallback is /profile, but we're actually not using that. We're using the hx-get /profile. This is HTMX. So HTMX sees this and it goes, oh, I need to send a GET request to /profile. I'm going to assume that's going to send me back HTML, and then based on some of these other attributes on this element, I'll know what to do with it. So hx push URL true is going to take this value /profile, and it's going to push it to the history. So now we have /profile, so that you can actually go back to the previous page or forwards, and that's because of that hx push URL true. So we're getting that browser history, and then hx target is just saying where I want the HTML that comes back to be rendered to. Hx swap is saying by default it's inner HTML, but when you include it explicitly, you can set it to other things like outer HTML. So we're saying, hey, target the element with the ID of user-profile and swap its outer HTML. So swap the entire thing with the response that comes back from the browser. However, this hx select is super important here because it's not taking the entire template that gets responded from the server. It's actually taking a section of it, the section that has, it's an element that has the ID user profile. And so if we look at inside of userprofile.ejs, you'll see we have this layout, which is a boilerplate. It's going to have all of our doc type, HTML, head tags, body, and then everything gets rendered inside the body tags. Okay, so that's our boilerplate for our layout. Everything you see here goes inside of the body tags. So we don't have to keep rewriting it. We can use that across multiple templates. Like for example, the index.ejs template also uses the boilerplate layout. And so the only thing that gets rendered inside of the body element is going to be what you see here after that first line. Likewise, over on our profile, same difference. And so this is important because most of what you see looks the same. I haven't moved it into partials yet because there's just not enough code to worry about it. But the thing that differs here is instead of having this link, right, an anchor tag for view profile, we have these paragraph tags for the username, the email, and the reset password. But they live inside this div called user profile. And so even though the server's responding with this whole template, the front end already has most of the stuff that we need from index.ejs. And so what HTMX here is telling us is, hey, when you get this HTML that gets rendered from this profile.ejs template, just pull out the user profile div. That's all I want. And then replace the user profile div. So just give me the profile and replace the link to the profile with the actual profile. And so if you go here and we can use the back button now, over here to the home page, and we click on view profile, rather than reload the whole thing, or in the case of HTMX, dynamically update the DOM, we click on view profile and all it's doing is replacing this section right here. Just this section. Everything else stays the same. Okay, and that's cool. We can actually probably inspect it and see that happening. And so if you go here, you can see here's this div, blah, blah, blah. Look at this div. When I click on this, see if we can zoom in a little bit. Watch what happens. Everything stayed the same except for this div. They truncated it, but essentially this div's contents changed. It's actually a whole new div, but it's got the same ID. And then the contents are updated with everything that we're seeing here. Pretty cool. Okay, but we also set it to where hx push URL is true, meaning we get this / profile in the URL bar, which is cool because now we actually have a history. We can go back to the previous page we were on, even though all these updates are happening on a single page application, but we're getting a browser history. And if the user were to bookmark this page and come back later, / profile, it loads everything because when it goes to / profile, it's accessing this route right here, / profile, checks to see if the user's logged in. If they're not, it's going to take them back to the home page. But let's assume they are logged in. They've still got a valid session for the week that we told them that they could have it. And it goes on to render user profile. Well, what will happen is because the request didn't come from that view profile link on the home page, the index.ejs template, it's actually going to render the entire template, which still uses the same layout as the index, so we don't have to worry about writing that code twice. But all this other code here is going to get rendered, and so whether you're coming here from a page refresh, or you're coming here from entering this into the URL bar and pressing enter, or you're coming here from the home page where you click on the view profile link, it's always going to look the same. Even though what's happening behind the scenes is that when you click this link, it's just updating that small section. Great, dynamic, beautiful user experience, wonderful. Or bookmark or refresh, whole template. Still loads fast. Obviously, there's nothing here but a couple lines of text. But point being is that the user is always going to see the same thing regardless of how it's handled on the back end. And we didn't have to create multiple files to handle that, or multiple routes even. We have one route, we have one template. If you wanted to, you could throw some partials in here to make things a little more modular, but we haven't gotten to that point yet. So some pretty interesting things here being done with HTMX. I think it's really neat. PocketBase for user authentication. It's going to give us easy access to creating our schemas for the rest of all of our collections, our tables, and tying them into our users and creating relationships between them and just being able to prototype a SaaS application really quickly. So this took me, I think I'm on my 4th day, so let's just say maybe like 6 hours to throw together, just tinkering with it and having fun. Writing everything from scratch except for a little bit of assistance from Cody, which is a AI type tool for Visual Studio Code where I can just do something like Alt-K and then I can tell it like, hey, write me a blah blah, and it'll write it out, and then I just go through and visually look at it and say, okay, that's good, or no, I need to change that. Or if there's something in here that I didn't fully understand, if I'm in app.js and I'm like, what does it mean to serialize a user? then I can go over to Cody and I can have a chat. And I can chat with my code base, so it already knows app.js right here. I'm asking it a question about this file. Or I think there's the ability to chat with documentation. I'm not sure. But in my case, what I'm really concerned about is a specific topic. So I would just ask it as if I'm on, Claude's or Anthropic's Claude 3 or ChatGPT from OpenAI, whatever. None of that matters. Just I don't have to leave my editor, and I can still ask questions of like, explain this thing to me, teach it to me like I'm, in 5th grade or whatever, and I can figure out why something in my code is doing what it's doing and understand my code base better that way. So Cody's pretty cool. Check it out if you haven't already. They have a really generous free tier that makes use of Anthropic. Well, I think you can choose which models to use, but in my case, I think I'm using Anthropic Claude 3. Someone's going to be mad if I keep pronouncing it like that. Anthropic. Is that better? Anthropic Claude 3 Sonnet, I think. Anyway, that's it. Just having fun coding. Thought some of you might enjoy seeing what I'm working on here. And this is available publicly. I'll put the link to the repo down in the description of the video if you want to pull it down. I don't have any documentation for it yet. I need to add tests. I need to add documentation. But like I said, this is like my 3rd day working on it. So, and I've been doing it in my free time. But we'll get that stuff added. So if those of you that are interested in the stack want to learn more about PocketBase, you'll know where to go to create your own PocketBase server and anything else that you see here that you want to learn more about. So I'll add the documentation and the testing as soon as possible. But in the meantime, feel free to clone this down and mess around with it. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Can't wait to see y'all next time. Peace.